Well, the South African government has condemned in the strongest possible terms the latest acts of violence and aggression carried out by Israeli armed forces along the Gaza border, which has led to the deaths of over 50 civilians. The victims were taking part in a protest against the inauguration of the U.S. Embassy in Jerusalem. This latest violence has resulted in scores of other Palestinian citizens reportedly injured and the destruction of property. We're joined now in studio by Boycott Divestment and Sanctions spokesperson Kwara Kekana. Good evening to you and thank you for talking to us. A conversation I've been having throughout this evening, if we're looking at the broader issue of that Middle East conflict, is the two-state solution a dead idea?
I mean, thank you very much, Pongani, for having BDS on the show, firstly. But I think when you look at, the current conditions and the continued annexing of land by Israel and annexing of more and more Palestinian land, it really looks like the two-state solution is no longer a viable solution. What the Israelis are continuously doing is expanding the settlement industry, which is illegal under international law. So if you speak honestly, if you look at the map, really the annexing of more and more land makes the two-state solution no longer viable.
You would have heard just before this interview my engagement with Ben Swartz from the South African Zionist Federation. He specifically will blame Hamas. They will blame campaigns such as yours for inflaming the situation. And of course, they've objected strongly to South Africa's withdrawal of its ambassador to Israel. And they're saying all of these actions, if anything, put Israel in a corner. And that's why we're seeing some of what we're seeing there. The
first thing is that nobody's picking on Israel. If you're going to be a state that chooses to practice the policy of apartheid, you're actually picking on yourself. You're making yourself a target, and in the same way that South Africa, applied the policy of apartheid and made itself a pariah state. So nobody's picking on Israel. And it's a rhetoric and a narrative that the South African Jewish Board of Deputies, together with the South African Zionist Federation, want to adopt continuously. The other, I think, narrative that they adopt often is the question of Hamas. And I think in the previous segment, when you're engaging with Brapen, the one thing that he keeps reiterating is that Hamas is the problem. And you stated quite clearly that I think it's something also the Doctors Without Borders make the same assertion that, number one, we're seeing, wounds on a civilian population. And a lot of the wounds are entry wounds from the back, which means people are running away. So, and these are people that are demonstrating quite peacefully in the Palestinian Gaza Strip. And again, we talk about the right to resist an occupation. So under the 4th and 5th Geneva Convention, people that find themselves under a situation of conflict and occupations in particular, have a right to resist occupation by any means necessary. And this is something that's afforded to them by international law.
There will, of course, be a lot of sympathy with the Palestinian cause in South Africa, with our own history having emerged out of apartheid. But if we think about strategically and in terms of the long term of what can be achieved, the reality is the Israeli government, particularly with a right-wing American administration in the White House, have absolutely nothing to lose in all of this, do they?
I mean, the one thing is, in terms of when you look at the kind of support that the Palestinians are receiving internationally as well, and you're right, you're saying that there is a lot of sympathy for the Palestinian cause. And in the South African case in particular, the one would be, I think, the similarities among our own struggles, the shared history of apartheid between what Palestinians are going through today and what we went through during the struggle for our own apartheid. But the Israeli regime, for example, might be getting a lot of support from the Trump administration itself. But, the support on the ground is not the same. We're seeing a lot of support coming from, for example, organizations in the U.S., such as Jewish Voices for Peace within the U.S., leading some of the biggest boycott, divestment and sanctions campaigns.
None of those voices are nearly as powerful as the lobby that is supporting various or successive U.S. administrations to make sure that Israel remains a very strong ally of Washington.
Look, the anti-apartheid movement, for example, took 40 years. The BDS, or the Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions Global BDS campaign, is about 12 or 13 years. And the kind of victories that the BDS movement has managed to register in the last 13 years alone is quite significant. And it's quite important to point out that when you look at the various regions in which the various Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions kind of campaigns that, people are waging on the ground, and the kind of support that we're getting also from governments as well. When you look at the European continent, some of the European countries, for example, the Norwegian government coming out and affirming the right to do BDS, the Swedish government as well coming out and affirming the right to do BDS, the Dutch government doing the same as well.
I hear all of that, but as far as, a campaign, whilst it might obviously have some impact, it's certainly a low-key key impact campaign in terms of the wider issues that would force the Israeli government to the negotiating table. One of the things that's often discussed about South Africa's peaceful settlement was a realization on both sides that they had an interest in coming to the table. The Israeli side will say Hamas and even latterly, Fatah don't have that kind of initiative, don't have that kind of resolve.
I think, number one, we're not saying that, for example, isolation campaigns are a silver bullet. In the same way, for example, the struggle against apartheid in South Africa, there were a number of strategies that we used to, kind of get to where we are today, the internal resistance campaign, the international boycotts campaign, the armed struggle, for example. So we're not also saying that the isolation campaigns are a silver bullet. But definitely it is one tactic that the Palestinians themselves have identified and have called for the international community to embark on a campaign to isolate Israel and to force it to comply with international law. So while at the same time you're embarking on a BDS campaign, other things could be happening at the same time, be it negotiations, or other tactics that can be employed to get to hopefully where South Africa finds itself today.
All right, we'll watch this with interest as it unfolds in the coming days. That is Kwara Kekana, who is the spokesperson for BDS.